AP Econ Class is video 2 for your Phillips curve. In this video we're going to talk about the long run Phillips curve, the natural rate of unemployment, and the role of expected inflation. If you remember from the last video, this blue squiggly line here represents like the mirrored effect of the aggregate supply model onto the Phillips curve model. And I've drawn the two different types of Phillips curve that we're going to deal with. The first one is the short run Phillips curve, as we remember from our last video. And then the second one is the long run Phillips curve. The long run Phillips curve is it's easy to remember. It mirrors with the long run aggregate supply curve, which is also vertical. So the short run Phillips curve mirrors with the short run aggregate supply curve, and I'm going to just draw it linearly this time. So what we have at the intersection of these two curves is point A and point A, and those 2 points are in theory the same. So what we need to do is understand what happens in this model if something changes. Let's say we're at point A, which is our short run equilibrium in our economy, and then something changes, perhaps due to an increase in net exports or something. Aggregate demand goes up. Remember from our last video that if aggregate demand increases, we see a shift along the Phillips curve, not of the Phillips curve. And so we move from point A to point B, and so that would look like this, from point A to point B. Now it's worth pausing here and taking a look at how this is not on our long run equilibrium in either model. So something is going to be messed up. The long run curve at least suggests a couple things. Let's start with the aggregate supply model. This is our equilibrium level of output. This is like what we can produce given the number of hours in a day, number of workers that are participating in the labor force. And so this is the equilibrium level of output, and that's at point A. If we're at point B, we're actually beyond that, and that's not very good. That means, that sounds great. I'm able to produce more than I was before, but that means you're overworking your resources, and so you're going to end up having something screw up. Same thing for point A to point B on the Phillips curve. The long run Phillips curve suggests our long run output, but remember, it's measuring unemployment. So where this curve intersects with the x-axis here on the unemployment thing is called NAIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Basically, you can consider this the natural rate. I know it doesn't mean that, but consider that the natural rate of unemployment. It's the rate of unemployment that prevails in the long run. It includes frictional, it includes structural unemployment. So it's not zero. It doesn't mean that everybody is working in the economy, but it means that there's no cyclical and no seasonal unemployment. So what's going to happen in this economy is we're going to see an adjustment back to equilibrium. At point B in long run aggregate supply model, there is no competition for work. At the natural rate of unemployment, at A, everybody's working except for these frictional and structural people, and then the people who aren't in the labor force. But at point B, where more people are working than were before, so what any smart worker would do is they would negotiate for higher wages. And since wages are an input cost, what would end up happening is the supply curve would decrease. So to explain this again, what we see is workers negotiate for higher wages, which increases input costs. And so we end up going back to our equilibrium, let's assume. We're at SRAS 2 now. So all we've done in the long run is it looks like we've just increased the price level. And what that looks like over here is, you remember that the short run Phillips curve is simply just a mirror image of the supply curve. So if this supply curve shifts that direction, that means that the short run Phillips curve is going to shift out as well. So we should see a shift to there. Let's say. This is a hypothesis put forth by Milton Friedman that in the long run, what prevails is the natural rate of unemployment. And the only way to improve the situation of unemployment is to move the long run aggregate supply curve. So if we go back and we just check out the two long runs, you'll see the same mirrored relationship. The only way to improve this natural rate of unemployment, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is to move the long-run Phillips curve, or as we know, because they're mirror images of each other, to move the long-run aggregate supply curve. And so go back and think about in Chapter 9 when we talked about determinants of economic growth. If we can grow the economy due to like some new technology or a variety of other factors, if we can shift the long-run aggregate supply curve out, this will just be y1 and this will be y2. What will end up happening is a mirrored image effect where the long-run Phillips curve will actually shift inward. And this is good. Remember, the Phillips curve is kind of a bad choice between inflation and unemployment. There's no good point. What Milton Friedman wanted you to know about this curve is that it doesn't provide like a menu of options for politicians. What it does is it shows that in the long run, the natural rate of unemployment will prevail, whether it be here or here. It all depends on what your economy can potentially do. So the consequences of this are that politicians should not focus on the short run, but focus on the long run. Of course, we know in reality that politicians focus on, and the people who decide what happens to our fiscal and monetary policies decide what happens in the short run so that they can maintain their jobs and that sort of thing. So in the next video, we're going to discuss supply shocks and how they relate to Phillips curve.